About 10 years ago, I was visiting the occupied West Bank. I was visiting a town known as Nablus. It's one of the largest cities in the West Bank, and one of the largest concentrations of Palestinians in the West Bank. And as I visited this historic city, it's basically it is the city of Shechem from the Bible, but fast forward 2,000 years or 2,500 years. But as I walked through the old marketplace in this ancient city, I began to notice lots of Palestinian posters advocating for free Palestine or advocating on various behalfs. And this was at a time of tension. This was actually during the 2014 Gaza war. This would have been July 2014. And I caught a sight of these pictures of Saddam Hussein. And at the time, I'd been studying the Middle East for about 8 years, and I was kind of taken aback because in my mind, I'd always just viewed Saddam Hussein as this ruthless dictator that had governed Iraq. And I hadn't studied Iraq very much, and somebody who clearly didn't respect human rights and all these other things. And here were these posters praising him in Palestine. And so it caused me to not necessarily rethink who Saddam Hussein is, but to further investigate. And so what I hope to explain today, we're going to be talking about Iraq. We're going to talk about who Saddam Hussein was and how he shaped both the Middle East and Iraq more specifically, and how he was shaped by Iraqi history by himself. That's what I hope to explain today. So we're going to cover a lot of history, but primarily we're going to end on the eve of the U.S. invasion in 2003 as something to think about here. So in order to really get into this, we need to first start back when Iraq was formed. All right. So if you guys remember, a couple of weeks back, we're talking about the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the San Remo conference, in which the borders of Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, however we want to define it, began to be drawn and separated from each other. Borders around Kuwait and all those things are drawn during this time. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of the British and French in the way they drew these borders, is because they neglected to account for the history of this region and the makeup of this region. It's not to say that that the Arabs and the Kurds and the people who lived in this area that would become Iraq could not function together, that there were these deep historical divides that divided Sunni Arabs and Shia Arabs or Kurdish peoples. But there were some regional differences. And for example, if we are going to look at Iraq, for example, in the northeastern areas around Mosul, the dialect of Arabic that is spoken is more similar to what you'd find actually in eastern Syria, and even all the way to a place like Mosul, like Aleppo in Syria. And so we could argue that historically, the cultural ties that bind were separated in some cases and united with other polities, say Baghdad and Basra, which were more historically united together and maybe even more closely aligned with, say, like Kuwait. So if you listen to the Kuwaiti dialect today, what people speak in Kuwait, it is more similar to what people in Baghdad, people in Basra are speaking in these major towns in Iraq than what people are speaking in Mosul. And of course, it's completely different than what's being spoken in the Kurdish regions. But one of the biggest criticisms is that it brings all of these people together that haven't historically operated in a single system, in a single polity. And so first, let's just note the demographic divisions that exist in Iraq. After Iraq is created, you have Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and then you have a Kurdish population. So these are ethnically different from the Arab populations. Most of the Kurds are Sunni, but they primarily identify, rather than identifying by Sunni or Shia or Arab, they primarily identify through that ethnic lens of Kurdish. So even though they are Sunni, they often don't find common cause with the Sunni Arabs. And then, of course, you have a smattering of Christians. Probably about 5% of the population was Christian back then. It decreases over time. But you also had Jews, you have Yazidis, and you have several other religious and ethnic groups, Circassians as well, that all exist in this somewhat cosmopolitan milieu that is Iraq. Now, the other important part about the imperial role here is Iraq is primarily a British possession. The British want to control their important oil reserves in Iran. They assume that there will be oil to be found in Iraq. This is motivating their claims to this territory to extract oil, or to at least have British companies become and get involved in the oil industry, which of course it does. And the British have promised to Sharif Hussein that his family will oversee a future Arab state. And so when there are some ambiguity in these promises, the British, trying to hold as best they can to the ambiguity of their promises to the Hashemites, or to Sharif Hussein's family, places one of Sharif Hussein's sons, Faisal, who led the Arab revolt, on the throne in Iraq. And, so many of the locals, this is somebody who's coming from outside. Remember, the Hashemites, they are a tribal group that is from Saudi Arabia, or specifically the Hejaz in the Arabian Peninsula. And even though Sharif Hussein and Faisal have some level of charisma, they're still kind of an outsider that is being placed on this throne. No need to get into this too long, but there is a brief period of British control of Iraq, but really Iraq is granted independence much earlier than most of the other mandates, and they get independence by 1932. But as you can imagine, with an outsider on the throne, and with all of these, an outsider that is being placed on the throne by another outsider who is neither Muslim, neither Arab, etc., there is a lot of tension within Iraq, and there's a lot of political factions, and there's not a lot of stability. So when we look even in early independence, there's an attempted coup in 1936. There's another attempted coup in 1941. The coup in 1941 officially worries the British, specifically around issues around World War I and Iraq's relationship with the Axis powers, with specifically Italy and Germany. And eventually the British will reoccupy Iraq during World War II, from 1941 to 1945, just as they did in Iran. But this is kind of setting up the background. And in Iraqi history, there is all of this kind of political instability. And of course, this does not end the foreign intervention, the attempts to be able to control, because by the time we get to the post-World War I world, World War II world, post-1945, and we're entering into the Cold War, the issue is communism. There's worries about communism, and they have this monarch on the throne in Baghdad who is loyal to the British, maybe not, it's not the best way to describe it, but who is allied to a certain level with the British, has somewhat done their bidding, and so he's viewed as a puppet by many of the locals. But also, this monarch sees his fate tied to the West, sees it tied to, whether it's the United States, the British, but generally the Western side in the Cold War. And so Iraq becomes a centerpiece in what becomes known as the Baghdad Pact, that is set up in 1955, in February of 1955, that includes Iran, it includes Turkey, and there is attempts to get other powers to join the Baghdad Pact that eventually fail. Because the biggest power, in the most influential person in the Middle East, by the time we get to 1955, is who? If you guys remember from what we've talked about earlier, it's a guy named Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt. And the president of Egypt has basically said, colonialism bad, and anything that even remotely smells like colonialism, like granting sovereignty to outside powers, is not good. And so Gamal Abdel Nasser, he's enormously influential. He condemns the formation of the Baghdad Pact. Basically, he doesn't want to see people allied too closely with the Soviets or the Americans, even though he's a little bit closer to the Soviets. At least that's how it appears. And Nasser inspires across the Middle East a number of copycats. And we've talked about all the revolutions that start taking place across the Middle East, the number of military coups in which monarchies are overthrown and replaced by military dictatorships or some form of military dictatorship. And so the main one that shapes the future of Iraq is the 14th of July coup that takes place in 1958 that is led by two military officers, Abdul Karim al-Qasim and Abdel Salam al-Arif. Now, Abdul Karim al-Qasim is the leader of this movement. He sees himself kind of following in Nasser's footsteps, an Arab nationalist seeking to unite the Arabs all together, and in a sense supports what Nasser is doing in Egypt, even supports to a lesser extent this kind of idea of political union like we find with the United Arab Republic that emerges in February of 1958 as well. But this coup is also really bloody. So if we look at the Free Officers' Revolution, the king in Egypt is essentially sent into exile. But the king in Iraq, Faisal's family, so Faisal has passed away, but his descendants are basically dragged out of the palace. They're shot in front of everybody. It's a bloody mess, and it is incredibly ugly. And as well as Nasser, they're speaking out on behalf of we're going to liberate Palestine, we're going to do all of these things. One of the challenges is unlike Egypt, the political instability continues. Abdul Karim al-Qasim, he doesn't last long on the throne. There are early on disagreements between him and Arif over how the steps that the country should move forward with and how to divide power between the two individuals. And capitalizing on this instability are another group of military officers, specifically ones who are very closely tied to what is going on in neighboring Syria. These are guys who have joined the political party known as the Ba'ath Party, which is this Arab nationalist movement, this Arab nationalist party that advocates for elements of socialism, elements of like Arab nationalist secularism, to unite Arabs under an overarching government and anti-colonialism, etc. And these military officers orchestrate a coup against Abdul Karim al-Qasim and basically imprison him and later execute him in 1963. Now, they don't last long, because just like everybody else, there's all of these problems, there's all this instability, there's all these factions, and you have competing coups take place. So the Baathists are really only on the throne or only have power for about 9 months before there is a second coup, a palace coup, in which Abdul Karim al-Qasim's co-conspirator, Abdel Salam Arif, seizes control. And Abdel Salam al-Arif, he rules the country for another 4 years and is displaced again by the Baathists in another coup in 1968. Now, you would think after all of this political instability, military coup after military coup, and if we were talking about Syria, there's similar history here where there's basically no peaceful transfers of power. Somebody gains power and they're in power until somebody else takes it from them. And Syria has a similar, but if you think about this, if you're a Ba'athist leader, your first idea is where are most of these coups coming from? They're coming from the military. And so how do we bring the military under our heel? How do we seize control of this? And there's 3 men that are primarily leading the charge here. 2 of them I expect that nobody here has heard of. And the first one is Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. And he's kind of the leader. He becomes president of Iraq or prime minister. He holds the executive power. And his right-hand men are a guy named Hardan al-Takriri and another individual named Saddam Hussein. Now, I expect that most of you have heard of Saddam Hussein, but if you haven't, he is obviously important in the Middle East history. And Saddam Hussein is the youngest of these 3 men, and rather than taking official office, he has an official place within the Ba'ath Party. So in this political party, this political apparatus that is, fueling the drive of Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr and Hardan Takriri, Saddam Hussein is kind of in charge of the political party, right? So you can look at, like, today, you have presidents in the United States or leaders, but you also, each political party has a head, right? And it's typically not the same as the head of the state because you need somebody else to handle the political party issues. Saddam Hussein falls into that level, and he is given some political posts. Now, one of the first orders of business is to ensure that there's not a second military coup. And so one of the things that you have early on going on is building up a secret police force that can go toe-to-toe to the military. You can weaken the military's power while also giving the military a rival that can actually challenge its ability to enact coercive force or use violence against people. The other thing you need to do in this situation is concentrate loyalty in the party and in society writ large to the party and its leaders. And so one of the things that emerges is something similar to kind of the Reign of Terror, maybe not on that broad scale, but you have these show trials. People are being charged on various trumped up charges and executed or imprisoned. Anybody that could be deemed a threat to Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr's authority. And Saddam Hussein's kind of the main henchman involved in this. He's the guy who is going around and he's appointing people into this new secret police force that in Arabic they call the Mukhabarat. And he is basically begins spying on the military, weeding out members of the military that might not be deemed loyal, and they set up this revolutionary command council that basically rewrites the constitution and solidifies a single-party state. So by the time we get to the mid-70s, in 1975, 1976, Iraq is essentially a single-party state, with the Ba'ath Party being the only political party in Iraq. It's also important to notice by this time there has been a serious rupture between the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and the Ba'ath Party that is in power in Syria. And there is a rivalry and tension that exists between these two competing elements that both argue that they are the voice of this Ba'ath Party that was established in the 1930s and 40s. Now, one of the challenges for the Ba'ath Party is a big challenge that has existed for most of Iraq's history, and it is the Kurdish question. You have these large Kurdish populations after World War I that are not given their own state. In fact, the Kurds in some estimates are the largest ethnic minority to not have a political state that represents it. And so you have the largest concentration of Kurds in Turkey, but you also have significant populations in Iraq, in Iran, and in Syria. It's smaller in Syria, but over time, the Kurdish individuals rebel at times, and especially with Arab nationalism being the primary motivator or the primary source of identification of the state, many Kurds feel like they do not have a place within this state. The other thing that becomes important to know about the Ba'ath Party during this period, it is monopolized by a ethnic and religious minority. I should say a religious minority. So it is dominated primarily by Sunni Muslims, and specifically Sunni Arabs, which make up, depending on how we calculate it, make up probably around 20 to 25% of the country's population. So it's not very representative. And something similar happens with the Ba'ath Party in Syria, only in Syria it's dominated by the Alawis instead of the Sunnis, whereas the Shia Muslims make up a majority, specifically the Shia Arabs make up a majority of the population there. And so because of this dynamic, there's a lot of distrust of Shia, or a lot of Shia aren't so much from the sense of their religion are they sidelined, but because they are viewed as possibly a fifth column, somebody who is not loyal to the state. There is a lot of issues with the Shia. Also, the Shia at this time, many of them support more radical policies more radical ideological movements, especially the Communist Party, is quite common amongst the Shia Arabs during this time. There's a famous saying, to be Shiite is to be communist during this time. The word for Shia and communist in Arabic is very similar. Shi'i, Shiu'i. I know that sounds kind of funny, but those are the two words, very similar. Hua Shi'i, Hua Shiu'i is the saying that they would go with there. And so you do have this protests that emerge against the Ba'athist regime. Now, the Ba'athist regime is fairly smart. One of the first things they need to do, and I think this is wise in any country, if you want your population to be happy, make sure the economic system is functioning. And so they began to bring oil under their control. So you eventually will have the nationalization of the oil industry, which brings all private oil companies under the control and ownership of the Iraqi government. So they control oil, they can fund various public works projects. And this is kind of seen in the 1970s as the heyday of Iraq. You have rising literacy rates, you have rising mortality rates, you have some of the best universities in the Middle East are in Iraq, in Baghdad. You get kind of the foundation of this idea of the saying that exists in the Arab world that Cairo writes, Beirut publishes, and Baghdad reads. Baghdad becomes, in many respects, while it is becoming an authoritarian police state, it is also becoming a place where there are serious Arab intellectuals who have read various ideas. And if you go to Baghdad, one of the most famous street, Al-Mutanabi Street, is a street full of bookshops where you can find just about everything under the sun to read. And during the 1970s, this is what is emerging. But it doesn't quell the opposition. There's still individuals who are pushing for greater political freedoms, etc. While all of this is going on, we have this important figure who is sitting in the background of the construction of this state apparatus, but is not in charge. And that is Saddam Hussein. Now let's roll this back for just a second and talk about Saddam Hussein and where he comes from. Saddam Hussein is born into a backward family. He's born into a poor, illiterate family of Sunni Arabs in, kind of a backwater town. It's like he's born in Dayton, Ohio, right? Like, I don't know anybody that just, Dayton, Ohio, that's amazing. That's a center of intellectual thought and everything else. It's just kind of the equivalent. Like, that's where Saddam is born. And he's ambitious. He has a lot of thoughts, and he has a lot of ambitions about where he wants to be, and he goes to school. He gets involved in all these competing ideologies, whether it's the communist movement or the Arab nationalist Nasserite movements or the Ba'ath Party, and he settles on the Ba'ath Party. Now, in 1959, there is a failed assassination of Abdul Karim al-Qasim. Because of Saddam Hussein's involvement with the Ba'ath Party, he flees the country, flees to Cairo, Egypt, where he finishes high school. When he returns after the Ba'ath coup in 1963, the counter coup ends him up in prison. So he ends up in prison from about 1964 to 1966 before breaking out of prison, being involved in the second Ba'ath coup, and really at this point, he's not that much of an ideological person. He is somebody who is seeking to get ahead. He's not really a devout Muslim. He's not really somebody who sees the future of Iraq in religious terms. And he's not even somebody who necessarily sees them in strictly ideological terms. But he is somebody who sees the Ba'ath Party as a vehicle for his own ambition and progress. Now, after that coup, he is placed in charge of the party, but he also has a lot of power through the party to appoint people to the mukhabarat, or to the secret police, to this newly established rival to the military. And Hussein is able to build a network of patronage, right? So he's able to dispense jobs to individuals, to tribal leaders, to other Sunni Muslims, not so much because they're Sunni Muslim, but because this is a way of concentrating power nodes that are loyal to Saddam Hussein above any other group throughout the government. And as the 1970s wane on, and al-Bakr remains in presidency, Saddam Hussein really becomes the man calling all the shots. He is able to control all of the territory, or he's able to control all the things going on. And if you think about it, if you're the head of the FBI, if the FBI didn't have any rules that kept it from spying on citizens, you'd have all the information, right? You could bribe people. You know who's plotting a coup. You know who doesn't like the president, who does. And you could ask for favors. You could say, hey, I can lock you up. And you can use threats and coercion to increase your power. So by the time 1979 rolls around, the president of Iraq is pretty old. Saddam Hussein he's served his time. He's entering kind of those prime age. He's in his 40s, and he's ready to assume power. The way he does it clearly is not interesting, but he basically puts pressure on the president to resign, and he steps into office after after al-Bakr's resignation in 1979. Saddam Hussein quickly moves to quash any threat. And there's the famous story of Saddam Hussein, and this is kind of the ruthlessness of Saddam Hussein, in which he goes into parliament. He has all of the political thinkers and all these political leaders. It'd be like going into Congress, right? And basically he has a list of names, and he has all these men come up, and he says basically that these are all conspirators that were planning to carry out a coup against me. All of you guys come up here. And then he basically, to the rest of Congress, he gives them guns and basically says, you guys dispatch with these guys. These guys are traitors. What's the punishment to be a traitor? And he has them executed. Now, this appears very much to be kind of a trumped up charges. And this is primarily a way of Saddam testing the loyalty. If you're not willing to kill one of these men, then Saddam, of course, is going to kill you. So you have to, as somebody who's not accused, and it sets the picture quite clearly that loyalty to Saddam above all else. Saddam is the most important individual. And Saddam obviously has a big ego, but is very ambitious. This is at a time when Egypt is moving to accept Israel and moving towards the peace process. Camp David's moving. This is at a time Nasser is still fresh in the memory of many Arabs, even though his popularity has waned. And Saddam, in many respects, wants to step into those shoes. He wants to be the new leader of this greater Arab world. In some cases, people describe him as the new Saladin. So rather than moving like, say, Jordan, that has really tried to move away from any kind of conflicting relations with Israel, and Egypt has actively moved towards peace with Israel, Saddam takes the opposite track. And he begins to talk about how I'm going to liberate the Palestinians. He begins to fund the PLO or PLO movements. He engages in building patronage networks among the Palestinians, and he uses his own propaganda as kind of like, look, I am out to protect the Arab people. Now, something happens in the same year as Saddam's rise to power, and we talked about that last week. That is the Islamic Revolution in neighboring Iran. Remember, the Islamic Revolution, led by Khomeini, wasn't satisfied to just be an Iranian product. The attempt was to export this, and they tried to export it to Iraq, they tried to export it to Saudi Arabia, and they exported it in some sense to Lebanon. And if you remember from the very first few minutes of this discussion or this lecture, the majority of Iraqis are Shia Muslim, just like the majority of Iranians, the vast majority of Iranians are Shia Muslim. And it isn't to say that the majority of Iraqi Shia supported what was going on in Iran, but it immediately made them suspect in Saddam Hussein's mind. He also shared a border with Iran. There had been a series of disputes over that border. Remember, these are borders that the British primarily drew up, and Iraqis disagreed with where these borders should exist. In fact, in 1975, there was kind of a rapprochement between Iran and Iraq, and the Iran-Iraq war that erupts shortly after Saddam Hussein comes to power probably doesn't erupt if the Shah of Iran maintains power during this time. One of the things that's problematic here is you have a faction of the Kurdish people under the leadership of a clan of Barzanis who have allies across the border in Iran, and they consistently go over to Iran when Iraq isn't meeting their needs, and Iran's support for these Kurdish provocations upsets Saddam. The border dispute upsets Saddam. And of course, the American hostage crisis that emerges after the Islamic Revolution when a bunch of students, Iranian students, seize control of the American embassy in Iran, means that Saddam is not really worried about the United States stepping in on Iran's behalf. And for whatever reason, Saddam Hussein moves towards provocation, and war breaks out in 1980. Now, I'm not going to do a step-by-step breakdown of the war. The war was long. It was bloody. It was expensive. Iraq borrowed heavily from its neighboring Arab allies. It borrowed from the Kuwaitis, from the Saudis. And eventually the war ends in a stalemate. While Iraq makes early gains, eventually those gains are thwarted, they get pushed back, and it just ends in a stalemate. During the war, you also have groups of Shia who are politically oppressed. They are put to the ringer because they are viewed as, you might be loyal to what is taking place in Iran. And so you have this large concentration of Shia Arabs that are basically placed under military rule. At the same time, you have Kurdish populations that had previously had ties to the Iranians that frustrate Saddam as well. So as the war is winding down, Saddam is also extracting a heavy price from his own population. He's punishing them, and the most famous is what becomes known as the Anfal campaign in the north against the Kurds. The most famous incident of this is the use of chemical weapons. Saddam uses chemical weapons in the village of Halabja in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan, killing hundreds of Kurds. And this ruthlessness of Saddam's rule is to show that he will not back down. Now, Saddam, at the end of the war, feels like he has done his Arab neighbors a solid. Basically, Iran has tried to export this revolution that is anti-Arab, it's anti-Sunni, it's anti all these things, right? And the Kuwaitis are Sunni and Arab, Kuwaitis are Sunni and Arab, the Saudis are Sunni and Arab, and we fought all of this with our men, and of course we got loans from the Kuwaitis, we got loans from the Saudis, but now it is time for you to do us a solid. That is kind of the way Saddam sees it. And basically, the way they could do a solid is to forgive debt. Saddam has about $30 billion in military debt at this time. Think about that. That's a lot of money, especially for a poorer country. And instead, Saddam Hussein runs smack dab into the politics of oil. Now, we've talked about supply and demand in this class before. You pump a lot of oil, you create a lot of supply, the price of oil goes down. You cut supply, the price of oil goes up. Kuwait and Saudi are flooding the market by the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Oil prices are cheap, which is great for Americans and everybody else. There's not much pressure to change things there. But if you're Iraq and you're trying to pay off your debts, that is not good. Saddam also suspects that Kuwait, who he shares a border with, is stealing his oil, is drilling into Iraqi territory, basically what they call slant drilling, drilling across the border, and sucking his reserves dry. So Saddam is not happy with the Kuwaitis. And then we can even go further back to Iraqi nationalists. Who creates Kuwait? The British. The British enter into an agreement with a local royal family and create this small sheikhdom that becomes Kuwait on the Persian Gulf. And so for many Arab nationalists and for many Iraqi nationalists, the argument is Kuwait doesn't have any right to exist. It's never been something separate from us as a territory. And so there's often been this tension. And so in the summer of 1990, the belligerence between Saddam and the Kuwaitis pushes up the scale. And in August of 1990, Saddam invades Kuwait. Now, for much of my life, I just thought Saddam just out and out invaded Kuwait, but that's actually not true. Saddam Hussein claims, he actually has a broadcast from the military from Iraq that broadcasts of there has been a coup in Kuwait, a coup of military Kuwaiti officers who are wanting union with Iraq, and Saddam argues that his invasion of Kuwait is responding to this. Now, this is also tricky because in Saddam's discussions with American leaders leading up to this, Saddam received no message that he would actually be that America would oppose this invasion of Kuwait. There is a famed quote from an American diplomat named April Gillespie, who discussed prior to the invasion of Kuwait, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, that basically to surmise it, she said, we view, this is an Arab on Arab dispute and the United States does not have a side. So Saddam thinks he's got the green light to invade. He invades. The invasion is pretty brutal, but Iraq does have a superior military force. It seizes control of Kuwait relatively quickly, which is a relatively small country. And quite quickly, the United States expresses its concern, calls on Iraq to withdraw. Iraq does not withdraw. And at the behest of the Saudis and U.S. interests, the United States sends 500,000 troops into Saudi Arabia, from where they will launch an invasion of Kuwait to expel Iraq's military force that has seized control of Kuwait. This becomes known as Operation Desert Storm. We'll talk about this later when we talk about Osama bin Laden, because this is a turning point in Osama bin Laden's relationship with the United States as well. The United States expels Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. It's not much of a fight. The United States it's almost like playing video games for U.S. military, that their military is so much further superior from the Iraqis. And as the war is ending, the message is given from the George W. Bush administration, or George H.W. Bush, administration, for Iraqis to rise up and overthrow Saddam, to replace him. What happens instead of the U.S. going in and finishing the job, if that's what you want to say the U.S. should have done? It's not what I'm arguing the U.S. should have done. But what happens instead is Saddam cracks down on the Shia and Kurdish populations who do seek to overthrow Saddam, who do have these tentative periods of resistance. So in the aftermath of the war and Saddam's ability to crack down, remembering what happened in Kurdistan at Halabja with the gassing of his own people, the United States sets up 2 no-fly zones, meaning the United States sets up basically the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force in southern Turkey and the U.S. Air Force out of Saudi Arabia, in which they carry out routine flights to ensure that no Iraqi military planes are flying in this area, so that they cannot use air superiority to oppress these populations. And so they also set a number of serious sanctions on Iraq that devastate the Iraqi economy, and Iraq goes into severe economic recession. I was once listening to an Iraqi talk about an Iraqi opposition individual who lived through the 1990s in Iraq and lived through Iraq through Saddam's rule. And she said, Saddam fed us war after war after war, from, Iran-Iraq war to the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, and then later on with the U.S. invasion that would create other problems. And this led to a decline in his population. It also meant a lot of Iraqis were hard up for food, hard up for jobs. You had literacy rates and all of the great progress that had taken place in the 1970s began to decline as Iraq became one of the poorer countries. But Saddam, seeking to bolster his reputation, continued to use that idea of kind of the new Saladin. I'm going to free the Holy Land. I'm going to expel Israel. So one of the things also in Operation Desert Storm, Saddam, as a way of trying to punish them, launched missiles into Israel. And this, of course, won Saddam a lot of popularity amongst Arabs, because many Arabs do, while they don't necessarily love Saddam for all of his authoritarian ways, they do look at Saddam as somebody who was not willing to be coerced and just bullied by the West, right? The United States, 1990 is the end of the Cold War, the US is the lone superpower, and Saddam was defiant. That message resonated, just like with Gamal Abdel Nasser, unwilling to bow to either the Soviets or the Americans. There was an idea of this is a man who speaks on behalf of the Arabs. Now, in order to maintain his control, Saddam's police state grew even more brutal. And unfortunately, the heavy U.S. sanctions that were placed on Iraq did not really affect Saddam that much. Saddam lived the good life. You know, he still was eating... he still had 5-star meals and everything else, while many Iraqis starved. And we can question the utility of sanctions in the 1990s. They did not remove Saddam from power, but this is the state of belligerence with these no-fly zones and sanctions, and Saddam Hussein becoming an international pariah. But in many respects, like other Arab strongmen, whether it's Muammar Gaddafi or we look at Gamal Abdel Nasser or the Assad family, Hafez al-Assad and later Bashar al-Assad in Syria, that had some credibility with the Arabs because they would not be coerced, they could not be threatened and bullied into submission by outside powers. So this meant that Saddam had some popularity during this time. Now, this is where we will end. Saddam will eventually, of course, be removed from power in Operation Desert, or not Operation Desert Storm, but in during the War on Terror and the Second Gulf War. And we'll talk about that further, actually, when we start talking about the War on Terrorism and terrorism more largely. But it's important for us to understand that the United States' actions during the 1990s, specifically in regard to Iraq, actually reinforce many Arabs' views that the United States does not want to allow Arabs to have autonomy. And so this plays into a certain narrative. We can dismantle elements of this and we can dispute the elements of this, but it doesn't change the fact that that narrative resonates with many people in the region during this time. And that is where we will end.